The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped insects as Katie Morrison moved through the ICU at Oak Creek Memorial, her shoes whispering against linoleum that smelled of bleach and something underneath it, decay masked by industrial cleaners. 3 years of 6 a.m. shifts had taught her the exact rhythm of this place, the way the cardiac monitors synced into an almost musical pattern if you listened long enough, the way the oxygen hissed through cannulas like breath held too long. She pushed the med cart with one hand, her clipboard balanced on her forearm, her navy scrubs fitting loose enough to hide what lay beneath, the scars across her shoulders, rope burns, and shrapnel that had healed into a topography of survival nobody here was meant to understand. The other nurses didn't look up as she passed. They never did. Katie Morrison was the quiet one, the competent one, the woman who never complained about double shifts, who checked post-op vitals with a precision that made the attending surgeons nod in approval, who somehow knew when a patient was crashing before the monitors did. What they didn't know was that her hands moved on muscle memory perfected not in nursing school but in a combat hospital in Ramadi, Iraq, where she'd learned to read the sound of a man's breathing and know whether he'd make it through the night. What they didn't know was that she'd held a collapsed building entrance open with her own back for 40 minutes while 12 wounded soldiers were extracted, that her call sign had once been whispered across radio frequencies in the kind of missions that didn't exist on paper, that the Pentagon had ordered her to disappear and she'd obeyed because soldiers follow orders even when those orders erase them. She checked the board. 7 patients in the cardiac unit. 3 post-op valve replacements recovering predictably. 2 acute MI cases stabilizing. 1 admission overnight with a fever that would probably resolve. And room for 07, the one she'd been assigned to since yesterday, the green beret who couldn't see her face. The door to 407 was cracked open. Katie pushed it wider with her hip, letting the light from the hallway spill across the bed where James Keller lay with his head tilted slightly, his sightless eyes tracking the direction of her footsteps before she'd made a sound. That was the thing about blind soldiers, they heard everything. They felt the displacement of air. They had other senses that compensated, that made them more dangerous in some ways than men who could see, which was probably why he'd been a green beret and probably why he'd served in Ramadi and probably why his arm bore a tattoo in block letters that read Morrison. Katie kept her expression neutral as she approached the bed, the same neutral expression she'd maintained for 3 years, the one that had become so automatic she sometimes forgot there was anything underneath it. She set the vitals cuff on the rolling table with a soft click, the antiseptic smell sharp in her nostrils as she reached for his wrist. His pulse was steady beneath her fingers. 78 beats per minute. Strong. Healthy. A green beret's pulse even now, even lying in a hospital bed with his eyes sewn shut by an IED that had also taken 40% of his vision and the ability to see his daughter's face. "Morning, James," she said, keeping her voice level, gentle, the voice she used with all her patients. "Checking your vitals this morning." He turned his head toward her and for a moment, just a moment, something flickered across his features. His jaw tightened. His hands gripped the blanket a little harder. But then it passed and he relaxed, and Katie understood that he'd heard something in her voice that meant nothing to him, some phantom memory that hadn't triggered. The tattoo on his arm meant he'd carried her out of a firefight in Ramadi. His sightless eyes meant he had no way of knowing that the woman whose name he wore was standing 3 feet away from him, taking his blood pressure like she'd never risked her life for his. She wrapped the cuff around his bicep and activated the automatic inflation. The air hissed softly as the cuff tightened. Numbers climbed on the digital readout. 128/82. Good. The machine beeped once and released its pressure with a sound like a small sigh. "How are you feeling?" Katie asked, writing the numbers in his chart with a ballpoint pen that clicked slightly as she pressed it to paper. "Fine," James said. His voice was calm, trained, the voice of a man who'd learned to hide pain the way other people learn to hide lies. "Slept okay. Had some dreams, but nothing I couldn't handle." Katie didn't ask what the dreams were. The cardiac unit was full of men who had dreams they couldn't handle, and she was well versed in the fiction of men telling her they were fine when their night sweats had soaked through 2 sets of hospital blankets. She pulled the blanket up from where it had twisted during sleep, her movements efficient and practiced. She didn't touch him more than necessary. She didn't linger. She didn't let her voice drop into the register that would have told him that she understood what those dreams were, because she had them too, not in sleep but in the hollow hours of 3 a.m. when she woke gasping in her apartment with her heart rate at 140 and her hands shaking so badly she had to sit on them. "I'll have someone bring your breakfast in about 20 minutes, Katie said, stepping back from the bed. "You need anything before I go?" "No," James said. "You're good, Morrison." He meant it as a general statement of gratitude, the kind thing soldiers said to the people who took care of them. But hearing her name in his mouth, a name that wasn't even her real one, a name that the government had given her when they decided that Senior Chief Katie Morrison didn't exist anymore, made something in her chest tighten like a fist. She left the room without responding, pulling the door almost closed behind her, the soft click of the latch period at the end of a sentence she couldn't speak. Back at the nurse's station, Katie began her documentation with a mechanical focus. She recorded vital signs, updated medication records, noted that the patient reported good sleep and stable mood. The work was rote enough to let her mind drift, which was exactly the kind of mental state she'd been trained to avoid but had learned to embrace, because the alternative was thinking about what had happened in Ramadi, about the missions that had been classified so heavily that even her parents didn't know what she'd done, about the extraction that had gone sideways and left 3 soldiers MIA and resulted in her being officially dead to the military, reassigned to civilian life with a new social security number and explicit orders to never surface. She didn't notice Dr. Hargrove until he was already beside her, his cologne arriving half a beat before his body did, something expensive and aggressively masculine that made her nostrils flare slightly. She'd learned to recognize his approach by smell because his shoes were expensive enough to barely whisper against the tile, and she was hyper-aware of anything that moved without sound. "Morrison," he said, and she looked up from her charting, keeping her face blank. "Post-op numbers on the valve replacements." "All 3 recovering within normal parameters," Katie said, turning the chart so he could see the vital signs documentation. "No fever, no arrhythmias, no complications." But she watched his eyes move down the supply orders she'd been reviewing, the ones that showed something was deeply wrong with the numbers, the ones that showed him exactly how much money was being generated by listing surgical supplies that never made it to operating rooms. His jaw clenched, just for a moment, just barely visible, and then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that made the hair on her arm stand up, the kind of smile she recognized from her time in Ramadi, the kind of smile a predator made when it realized it had a problem that needed to be removed. "Good work," he said, and his voice was smooth as oil poured into deep water. "Keep an eye on the Keller patient in 407. Green berets can be unpredictable." He walked away before she could answer, his expensive shoes carrying him toward the cardiac office with the kind of confidence that came from knowing the system protected him. Katie watched him go, and without thinking about it, her hand drifted inside her scrub jacket to the small patch sewn into the lining, a faded unit designation, barely more than a shadow now, the one piece of her old life she'd never been able to throw away. The threads were coming loose on one corner. She'd been meaning to fix it for 3 years but never had, because fixing it meant acknowledging it was still there, still part of her, still proof that there'd been a time when Katie Morrison was more than invisible. What happened next didn't just change her shift. It changed everything. The morning rounds at Oak Creek Memorial began like they always did, with the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical prayer and the ventilators wheezed their steady rhythm down the hallway. Katie pushed the medication cart past the nurse's station, where Dr. Hargrove stood with his hands in his pockets, the fabric of his white coat pulling tight across shoulders that had never known real pressure, never felt the weight of lives depending on split-second decisions. He was waiting for an audience, and he was about to get one. "I'll bet anyone here $20 that our little Katie quits by Friday," he announced, his voice carrying the practiced casualness of a man accustomed to being listened to. The nurse's station went quiet. 2 residents looked up from their charts. A phlebotomist paused mid-draw on a blood sample. "She doesn't have the spine for real medicine. 1 week, tops." "Who's in?" Katie's hands didn't pause on the medication cart. The foot drips inside the cassette continued their measured drops, indifferent to his words. She took one breath, measured, controlled, and when she spoke, her voice came out like flat water, so calm it seemed to lower the temperature in the room by 5 degrees. "I've seen real medicine, Dr. Hargrove. This isn't it. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that makes people notice the fluorescent lights are still humming. Hargrove's jaw tightened for just a moment, and his hand came out of his pocket. But he only smiled, that smile that didn't reach his eyes, the smile of a man who collected power the way other people collected watches. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. He'd already decided what Katie's punishment would be. 2 days later, the cafeteria was packed, shift change, 11:41 a.m., the narrow window when 3 shifts overlapped and the room became a compressed mass of tired healthcare workers trying to eat something before the next crisis demanded everything. Katie sat at a table with 2 nurses from pediatrics, a container of soup cooling in front of her, when Dr. Hargrove walked past carrying a cup of coffee and a plate with nothing on it except his own importance. He walked past her table once. Then he turned and walked back. The tray didn't fall by accident. It never does when someone calculates the trajectory carefully enough. His knee caught the edge of her table, and the motion was smooth, practiced, the kind of motion a man perfects over weeks of planning. The tray flipped. Jell-O splatters across the tile floor in a pattern like arterial spray, and the coffee spreads in a dark pool that smells like burnt rubber and broken promises. 3 staff members turn to look. 5 more follow. By the time the tray hits the ground, the entire room has noticed. Katie kneels to clean it up. Not because he told her to, but because the spill is a biohazard and there are protocols and she has never in her life walked past a problem that needed solving. Her movements are methodical, efficient, someone who has picked up far worse than spilled soup. 1 tear escapes her left eye before she wipes it with the back of her hand, and when she looks up, her eyes meet his directly. No flinching. No shame. Just acknowledgement. Clumsy, Hargrove says, standing over her as she kneels on the tile floor surrounded by paper towels. Just like you're charting. Katie stands, holding the ruined tray. I chart what I see, doctor. Every discrepancy. Every anomaly. Her voice doesn't change. It never changes. But the words land like a scalpel finding exactly where it's meant to cut. The 2 pediatrics nurses stare down at their food. A surgical tech suddenly finds the salt shaker very interesting. Hargrove's expression flattens for just a moment, she's seen something, and he knows it. Not what, not yet, but enough to make him understand that his calculation about firing her through ordinary means might need revision. But ordinary means are still available. He hasn't exhausted them yet. The breaking point comes during evening rounds, when the hallway outside room for 07 becomes a gauntlet. James Keller's chart is thick with notes, readings, the documentation of a life in decline measured in millimeters of blood pressure and fractions of oxygen saturation. Dr. Hargrove carries it like a weapon, because in his hands, everything is a weapon. Katie is checking James's for line when Hargrove emerges from the stairwell, papers in hand, his face arranged in an expression of casual dominance. Pick that up, sweetheart, he says, and before Katie can respond, he throws the chart. The papers scatter across the hallway floor like snow, like debris, like the detritus of something that's been destroyed. Some pages land near her feet. Others slide toward the nursing station. One lands halfway to the elevator. The hallway goes silent. A code cart stands in an alcove, indifferent. A monitor beeps somewhere down the corridor. Patients behind closed doors continue their slow deterioration, unaware that power dynamics are being recalibrated in the space outside their rooms. Katie doesn't hesitate. She kneels again, gathering the scattered pages with hands that have held steadier things than this, that have applied tourniquets at sunset in a place where ambulances came by helicopter, that have signed off on discharge papers she knew were forged. Her movements are methodical. Page by page. She reads dates as she collects them, admission notes from 72 hours ago, vital sign strips from the past 18 hours, a medication reconciliation form with her own handwriting on it. As she rises, she meets his eyes. There's no anger there. There's no fear. There's just the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse than this, from knowing that panic is a luxury item and she's never been able to afford it. I've picked up better men than you from worse places than this floor. The words hang in the hallway. Hargrove's jaw tightens. His hand opens and closes. For just a moment, something flickers across his face, recognition, maybe. Understanding that he's threatened someone and that person hasn't blinked. Katie slides the last page back into the chart and holds it at her side, waiting. Your shift ends in 20 minutes, he says finally. I suggest you use your break to start thinking about your future. I always do, Doctor. That night, after her shift, Katie sits in her car in the parking lot of Oak Creek Memorial with her laptop open and her hand shaking just enough to make the trackpad difficult to use. The trembling isn't fear. It's restraint. It's the physical manifestation of 3 years of pretending to be someone she's not, of watching a system corrupt itself around her, of carrying a secret so large it could swallow her whole if she let it. She pulls up the pharmacy billing system, access she shouldn't have, passwords she shouldn't know, and cross-references the numbers she's been collecting. Post-op infection rates tripled in exactly 6 months. All tied to the same surgical supply vendor. All approved by Dr. Hargrove on the procurement committee. She photographs the documents with a phone that still has Pentagon block numbers stored in it, even though those numbers are supposed to be disconnected, the woman who used them supposed to be dead. The numbers point to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Maybe more. A lake house in Hilton Head costs money like that. A man who throws charts on floors and makes bets about his employees' departures is a man who believes he's earned something. Katie photographs the last page and closes the laptop. She will not report this through normal channels. Normal channels require background checks that would shatter the carefully constructed lie she's been living. Instead, she will wait. She will document. She will gather evidence like ammunition, and she will keep her job for 1 more week, 1 more day, 1 more shift, because senior chief petty officers do not retreat. But that wasn't the worst part. That night, after Katie left the parking lot and drove back to the apartment that still had no photographs on the walls, Dr. Hargrove made a call to a board member whose campaign he'd funded with donations carefully routed through shell companies. He planted seeds about a nurse who'd been asking inappropriate questions, showing signs of instability, potentially presenting a liability issue that needed administrative attention. He was already building her termination file, meticulous and airtight, a structure so carefully arranged that by the time she realized it was happening, she'd already be destroyed by it. Katie Morrison stood at the nursing station on the 3rd floor of Oak Creek Memorial, fluorescent lights humming above her head like insects trapped in plastic, and she was looking at 6 months of data that didn't make sense, or made too much sense, depending on how you looked at it. Post-op infection rates in the cardiac unit had tripled. Tripled. In January, they'd run at 2.1%. Now they hovered at 6.8%, and every single case traced back to the same vendor supplying surgical equipment to Dr. Hargrove's operating room. She'd pulled the procurement logs herself during her lunch break, sitting in her car with the engine off, the vinyl seats already warming in the Savannah heat, scrolling through a hospital database that technically she wasn't supposed to access without administrative authorization. But Katie had learned a long time ago that the rules protecting civilians didn't always protect the patients. The vendor was called Sterling Medical Supply Solutions, and it had received exactly 47 orders from Hargrove's department in the past 6 months. 47 orders for sterile field equipment, sutures, for lines, and specialty instruments that should have been coming from the established suppliers at half the price. The discrepancy stared at her from the screen, 47 orders totaling $847,000. That number sat in her chest like a stone. She'd cross-referenced the hospital's established vendor agreements, and Sterling Medical wasn't even on the approved list. Someone had created an exception. Someone had signed off on a vendor that wasn't vetted through procurement. Someone was Hargrove. She pulled the supporting documentation, invoices, packing slips, delivery confirmations, and her eyes tracked the pattern like reading battle coordinates. The invoices were meticulous. Too meticulous. Every line item listed, every serial number documented, every delivery date stamped and filed. But the phantom consultations were buried deeper in the billing records, in a section labeled Specialty Cardiac Consultation Fees that listed names of physicians who, when Katie checked the hospital directory against a cross-reference with state medical licensing boards, didn't actually exist. Dr. Raymond Mitchell, Dr. Eleanor Cole, Dr. James Sebastian. All of them had submitted invoices to Oak Creek Memorial for expert consultation services ranging from $2,500 to $8,900 per session. All of them were ghosts. The fluorescent light directly above the medication cart flickered, steadied, then flickered again, and Katie didn't look up. She was thinking about the infection rates. She was thinking about the elderly woman in room 412 who'd come in for a routine bypass and left with a blood infection that ate through her system like rust through steel, requiring 3 more surgeries and 2 weeks in the ICU. She was thinking about the former construction worker in room 407. No, not room 407, that was James. She didn't think about James in conjunction with infection rates because her brain wouldn't let her. She was thinking about the retired accountant in room 408 who developed a sternal wound infection so severe he'd lost feeling in his left hand. 6 patients. No, 7. She'd counted 8 by the time she finished the documentation. Pain was information. That's what her field medic instructor in Ramadi had told her 18 years ago, kneeling in a dust-covered warehouse while mortar rounds punched through the concrete above them. Pain is data. Listen to it. Katie was listening. The data was telling her that Dr. Hargrove wasn't just billing for equipment and imaginary doctors, he was sourcing inferior supplies through Sterling Medical, cutting costs somewhere in the supply chain, pocketing the difference between what the hospital thought it was paying and what it actually cost to acquire contaminated or substandard equipment. The infections were collateral damage. The patients were spreadsheet entries. She created a separate file on her personal laptop that night, after her shift ended at 11 p.m., after she'd changed out of her scrubs in the locker room and noticed the envelope someone had taped to her employee badge slot. She didn't open it immediately. She sat in her car for 6 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, breathing like she was about to breach a building. Then she opened the envelope. Inside was a printout of the cafeteria incident, the one where Hargrove had knocked her tray to the floor 3 days ago, with a note in administrative font, regarding unprofessional conduct. Please see HR on Monday. The envelope had no signature. That wasn't administrative protocol. That was a message. She knew what a message looked like. At home, in her apartment on Forsyth Street with the AC unit running and the windows locked, Katie documented everything. She created a spreadsheet cross-referencing the phantom consultants' names against the billing dates. She pulled patient charts from the cardiac unit and photographed the infection timelines. She organized the procurement records by date and vendor, color-coding Sterling Medical's orders in red. She wasn't going to confront Hargrove with suspicions, she was going to confront him with evidence. Or rather, she wasn't going to confront him at all. She was going to compile this information and deliver it to someone who could actually do something about it. Someone in administration. Someone in compliance. Someone who didn't have a lake house that needed funding. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding, as she sat at her kitchen table at 2:27 in the morning with photographs of invoices spread across the laminate surface, that this was why Hargrove had started coming for her. She'd asked the right questions. She'd noticed the infection rates climbing. She'd requested clarification about the supply vendor in a departmental meeting last month, a single sentence, "Are we evaluating Sterling Medical's pricing against our established contracts?" That sentence had flagged her as a threat. That sentence had triggered this. The cafeteria incident, the humiliation in front of the staff, the chart thrown at her feet, none of it was random. It was calculated. It was designed to make her break, to make her quit, to remove her from the system before she asked more questions. The next morning, she arrived at Oak Creek Memorial 20 minutes early and went directly to the cardiac unit where James Keller was scheduled for a routine diagnostic exam. The room was quiet when she arrived, just James in the bed, his sightless eyes tracking toward the sound of the door opening even though he couldn't see her. He'd been in the hospital for 8 weeks now, recovering from a massive myocardial infarction that should have killed him. It didn't, because his heart was a thing that refused to quit, a muscle that had survived sandstorms and shrapnel and the kind of pressure that broke normal people. His tattoo caught the fluorescent light when she adjusted his gown, the word Sparrow in block letters across his shoulder, the call sign she'd earned somewhere in a Ramadi alleyway when she dragged him toward a helicopter while rounds snapped past her head like angry wasps. "Morning, Senior Chief," she said softly, because she always called him by his proper rank, and she'd never told him why. "How are we feeling today?" "Like a truck hit me twice," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Then backed up and hit me again." She smiled without looking at him and began the exam. Blood pressure. Pulse. Respiratory rate. Oxygen saturation on room air running at 96%, which was good. His heart rate was elevated, sitting at 92, but that wasn't unusual for post-MI recovery. She was listening to his lungs with her stethoscope, clear, no crackles, when she felt it. A tension in his breath. A guardedness. James's fingers flexed against the bedsheet, and she knew that gesture. That was the gesture of a man about to tell you something that cost him. "I keep hearing your voice," he said quietly, "and I can't place it. Been 37 days and that voice keeps triggering something in my head. Something I can't quite reach." Katie's hand stilled. The stethoscope hung against her chest. For 2.8 seconds, she didn't breathe, didn't move, didn't acknowledge that she'd heard him. Then she continued the exam. Heart sounds were clear. No murmurs. No irregular rhythms. Everything was exactly as it should be. "Sometimes our brains are wiser than we are, Senior Chief," she said, and her voice came out level as ice. "They remember things we've trained ourselves to forget." She was finishing the documentation on her shift notes when the attending cardiologist came by for the routine follow-up exam. Dr. Patricia Whelan, competent and thorough, had trained at Johns Hopkins and carried herself with the precise confidence of someone who knew exactly how much she knew and how much she didn't. She performed her own assessment while Katie stood in the corner, watching, checking vitals every 5 minutes like she always did, reading the monitors, watching the numbers. And then James's oxygen saturation dropped. 94, 92. 90. His desatting, Katie said clearly, and Dr. Whelan looked up from the chart, and that's when the monitor registered the pressure change in James's chest, a sudden spike in venous pressure, his breathing becoming shallow, his skin taking on that grey cast that meant his cardiovascular system was collapsing. Cardiac tamponade. The pericardium, the membrane surrounding the heart, had filled with fluid. The fluid was compressing the heart muscle, preventing it from contracting properly, squeezing the life out of him with the relentless patience of hydraulic pressure. His sightless eyes went wide, and his hand reached out blindly toward the sound of movement in the room. "Get cardiology down here," Dr. Whelan ordered, her voice sharpening, and someone was running, but that wasn't fast enough, and the on-call resident, a thin man named Morrison, no relation, Katie had checked, came through the door with his hands already shaking. He stared at the monitor, stared at James's dropping oxygen saturation now reading 84, and Katie watched his thought process slam into a wall. "Push epi," he said, but that wouldn't help, because the problem wasn't the heart's rhythm, it was the pressure crushing it. Katie moved. Her hands knew the procedure from scenarios practiced 8,000 times, in simulations and under fire and in moments of crisis when hesitation meant death. She called over her shoulder, her voice like metal striking metal, pericardiocentesis. "Now. I need an 18-gauge spinal needle and ultrasound." "That's not your call to make," the resident said, but he was saying it to someone who was already prepping the site, alcohol and chlorhexidine swabs in swift, practice motions. Dr. Whelan was moving toward the ultrasound machine, because she knew what she was hearing in that voice, knowledge. Authority. The sound of someone who'd done this before. Katie positioned the needle at the angle just above the xiphoid process, the entry point between the ribs where she could advance directly into the pericardial space without hitting the lungs or the myocardium itself. The ultrasound showed the fluid like a dark lake around the compressed heart, a massive effusion, maybe 400 cubic centimeters, maybe more. She advanced the needle slowly, felt the characteristic give as it penetrated the pericardium, and then she began to aspirate. Blood came back into the syringe. Dark, rich, arterial. 200 cc. 300. The pressure releasing with each draw, and she could see it on the monitor, the heart's electrical activity stabilizing, the pressure wave decreasing, the compressed organ finally able to expand and contract. James gasped, and his hand came up as if he could suddenly reach toward the person who'd just pulled him back from the edge. The attending surgeon who'd been called down from the second floor stepped into the room as Katie was finishing the procedure, and she could see the moment he realized what he was looking at. The precision. The confidence. The absolute absence of hesitation in every movement. He didn't say anything. He just watched, and then he looked at the resident, and then he looked back at Katie as she secured the needle in place and called for a chest X-ray to confirm positioning. From the doorway, Dr. Hargrove stood absolutely still. Katie could feel his attention on her like weight. She didn't look at him. She was talking to James, telling him his heart was holding, that he was stable, that the pressure was released. She was calling for the interventional radiologist to place a pigtail catheter to drain any remaining fluid. She was doing her job with the kind of competence that belongs in an operating theatre, not on a hospital floor. Within 57 minutes of James's crash, Hargrove had made the first call. The needle went in. Subcostal approach, 5th intercostal space. Katie's hands moved on their own, muscle memory older than her civilian identity. The 14-gauge angiocath needle slid through skin, through fascia, through the tough membrane of the pericardium. She felt the resistance give. The hiss of air escaping as 200 cubic centimeters of blood and clotted serum drained from around James Keller's heart. The monitor's flat line began its climb. 72. 80. 88. Sinus rhythm. The attending surgeon stood frozen 3 feet away, his mouth open, watching a floor nurse perform a procedure that required credentials she didn't officially possess. Katie didn't acknowledge him. Her focus remained absolute, on the drainage, on the vital signs, on James's pupils dilating back to normal as his perfusion restored. The room exhaled. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Hargrove stood in the doorway. He'd arrived mid-procedure, drawn by the code alert. He watched Katie's hand steady the needle, watched her read the pressure gauge with the confidence of someone who'd done this in sandstorms under fire, watched the attending surgeon's expression shift from panic to profound discomfort. For 57 seconds, Hargrove didn't move. He simply observed, his face draining of color as understanding crystallized. This wasn't a competent floor nurse. This was something else entirely. Someone with training that didn't match her file. Someone whose presence had just become existential. He turned and walked away from the doorway at 2:14 p.m. The first call came at 2:31 p.m. Hargrove's voice was smooth, conversational, the tone of a man discussing weekend golf plans rather than activating a network of institutional loyalty. "Gerald, it's Pierce. How's the Tampa office treating you?" The board member responded with the casual warmth of a man who'd received 3 campaign contributions totaling $87,000 from Hargrove's consulting network over the past 18 months. Hargrove didn't mention Katie. He didn't mention the crash or the procedure. Instead, he spoke about budget forecasting, about the importance of protecting hospital revenue streams, about how certain personnel sometimes developed issues that required sensitive handling. "Some of our nursing staff have been requesting advanced procedures without appropriate authorization," he said. "Creates liability. Creates questions." The board member understood. The conversation lasted for minutes. The second call went to Katie's listed previous employer, a Veterans Affairs facility in Norfolk that no longer had any record of her employment because the government had erased it. The number had been disconnected for 6 years. Hargrove knew this. He called anyway, leaving a detailed voicemail for a phantom supervisor, describing Katie's instability, her unauthorized procedures, her concerning behavioral patterns. The voicemail would sit in a dead inbox. It didn't matter. The call existed. The record existed. That was enough. The third call connected him to Harris, an outside HR investigator he'd worked with before, a woman with credentials so impressive and a reputation so carefully cultivated that her presence lent authority to fabricated concerns. Harris had helped him before, 5 years ago, when a pharmacist had discovered irregularities in the controlled substance logs. The pharmacist had left town within a month. Harris was efficient, discreet, expensive. Hargrove authorized the contract at $15,000. By 3:44 p.m., Harris was already in the hospital reviewing Katie's personnel file, her performance reviews, her shift schedules. Everything appeared exemplary on paper. That was actually better. Clean records made the deviation more shocking. Harris began documenting Katie's actions on August 14, the unauthorized pericardiocentesis, the advanced airway management implied by her notes, the procedures a floor nurse with 2 years of stated experience should not be capable of performing. She interviewed the attending surgeon. His statement was cautious, precise. Senior nurse Morrison performed an emergency intervention. The patient survived. I did not directly observe her training. Harris marked this as concerns about credential verification and questions about scope of practice. She interviewed Hargrove. He was measured, concerned, the picture of a physician troubled by safety issues. I've noticed some patterns, he said. Advanced procedures. References that don't check out. I actually tried calling her previous employer in Norfolk and the number was disconnected. It made me wonder. Harris noted this. By 4:15 p.m., she had a preliminary assessment. Personnel file contains inconsistencies regarding prior employment verification. Clinical observations suggest scope creep beyond stated credentials. Recommendation pending full investigation. Katie didn't know any of this was happening. She continued her shift, charting her work with the meticulous detail of someone trained to protect herself through documentation. Every fluid removed, every vital sign recorded, every intervention noted in clinical language. The problem was that her documentation was too precise, too professional, too familiar with terminology that floor nurses typically learned only in graduate programs. Harris would use that precision against her. These weren't the notes of a competent bedside nurse. These were the notes of someone with advanced training in critical care medicine. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2:19 p.m. Hargrove used the intervening 2 days to make 6 more calls. He spoke to a colleague on the hospital credentialing committee. He sent Harris 3 additional concerns he'd just remembered, instances of Katie working beyond her scope, instances of her questioning physician decisions, instances of her demonstrating knowledge she shouldn't possess. By Wednesday evening, Harris had compiled a 31-page termination recommendation with supporting documentation that looked airtight. It included Katie's personnel file, her missing employment history, her suspicious education records, a list of unauthorized advanced procedures, and, most damaging, a statement from the attending surgeon noting that while her intervention was successful, it raised serious questions about our credentialing protocols. Katie sat across from 6 board members on Thursday afternoon in a conference room that smelled like furniture polish and stale coffee. Hargrove was there too, seated to the left, his expression perfectly balanced between professional concern and personal hurt. "We value you, Katie," Margaret Chen, the board chairman, said. "That's why this is so difficult." She slid Harris's report across the table. 31 pages. Hargrove's network had worked fast. The attending surgeon's statement was on page 7. The employment verification failures were on page 9. The list of procedures that exceeded her stated scope was on pages 12 through 15. "I saved that patient's life," Katie said quietly. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Her jaw clenched once, then relaxed. A single breath through her nose. "You did," Margaret agreed. "And the hospital recognizes that. But our credentialing committee has concerns about your professional background. Your previous employer, the facility in Norfolk, their records don't contain any information about your employment there. No personnel file. No reference. Nothing." Katie couldn't defend herself. She couldn't explain that the Norfolk facility had never actually employed her, that her entire employment history for the previous 11 years had been manufactured by the government with explicit orders never to be verified. She couldn't explain that her nursing license was legitimate but purchased through channels that no longer existed. She couldn't explain that she'd been ordered to disappear after Operation Sandstorm went sideways, that an extraction had gone wrong, that 12 soldiers had survived because she'd held a position that couldn't hold, and that in exchange for their lives, the Pentagon had buried hers. New Social Security number. New driver's license. New employment history. New identity. Never surface. Never acknowledge. The paperwork was perfect. It was also completely false. I understand the concerns, she said. Her voice had dropped half an octave. Not defensive. Not afraid. Simply factual. The tone of someone who'd made decisions that cost her everything and had come to terms with the price. I can't explain my previous employment right now. I can only tell you that I was properly trained for the procedure I performed. The patient survived because of that training. We need to protect the hospital, Margaret said, not unkindly. We need to protect our patients. That means we need verifiable credentials. That means we need documentation we can review. She paused. Effective immediately, your employment at Oak Creek Memorial is terminated. The termination letter was placed in an envelope. 8 weeks of severance. COBRA information. Return of badge. Standard protocol. Katie accepted it without reading it. She stood. Thank you for the opportunity to work here, she said. The words were professional, measured. The attending surgeon, who'd been called in to witness the meeting, couldn't look her in the eye. Hargrove's expression was perfectly composed. He'd won. He'd protected his revenue stream. He'd eliminated the threat. Katie cleaned out her locker at 11 p.m. that Tuesday when the hospital was mostly quiet, the graveyard shift just settling into their routines. The locker contained a stethoscope she'd carried for 3 years, a blood pressure cuff, a pen light, 3 protein bars in the bottom, and her jacket. She pulled the jacket off the hook and reached into the lining. The faded unit patch was still there, the fabric worn soft from years of her fingers finding it during sleepless nights. Morale, welfare, and recreation patch from her SEAL Team 3 deployment. Charlie platoon. The last piece of her old life she'd never been able to throw away. She held it for a moment, then folded the jacket carefully and placed it in her bag. She took the service elevator to the 4th floor where James Keller was sleeping. His arm rested above the hospital blanket, the tattoo clearly visible in the fluorescent light, Morrison in block letters, the permanent reminder of the day she'd carried him 300 meters through a firefight to the extraction point. His sightless eyes were closed. His breathing was steady, the breathing of a man whose heart was no longer filling with fluid, whose pressure had been restored by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Katie touched the tattoo gently, her palm resting on the permanent ink for 3 seconds. "I'm sorry, Keller," she whispered. "I'm sorry I can't stay." She didn't say goodbye. Goodbye would have required her to turn around and leave, and she wasn't ready for that choice. She simply removed her hand, turned, and walked to the elevator. The Savannah VA hospital waiting room smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. Katie filled out her intake paperwork at 9:27 a.m. on Wednesday morning, sitting in a plastic chair among the veterans she'd once treated as a nurse. Most of them didn't recognize her in street clothes. Most of them didn't look up. She listed her chief complaints: chronic insomnia, phantom pain in her shoulders, anxiety about loud noises, difficulty with crowds. All true. All the small prices of having survived things that shouldn't be survivable. The intake nurse, a woman with kind eyes and 20 years of experience, asked about her military background. "Navy," Katie said. "Long time ago." "What did you do?" Katie stared at her trembling hands. They were shaking now, the restraint finally breaking. The hands that had performed surgery in sandstorms. The hands that had held lives together. The hands that had just lost everything because they were too competent at things they weren't supposed to know how to do. I carried people, she answered. When it mattered most, I carried them. The nurse wrote something in the intake file. Someone will be with you in about 20 minutes. Katie sat back in her plastic chair and waited, her trembling hands folded in her lap, wondering if she'd lost the last piece of purpose she had left. She didn't know yet that James Keller had never stopped looking for her. Didn't know that his daughter had spent 8 years searching for the woman whose name he'd tattooed on his arm the moment his vision came back enough to see permanent ink on skin. Didn't know that in the hallway 30 feet away, an orderly was just about to wheel that same blind green beret toward her plastic chair. Didn't know that 3 hours from now, a single word whispered by a man whose eyes couldn't see would change everything. The orderly's footsteps echoed down the VA hallway, the stretcher wheels squeaking with mechanical precision, and James Keller's head turned toward the waiting room with the uncanny awareness that only the blind possess, that invisible sonar that reads air pressure and presence like other people read faces. His sightless eyes found nothing. But his body recognized something his vision could not. He raised one hand, his scarred forearm catching the fluorescent light, and whispered a single word into the humming silence, "Sparrow." Katie's breath stopped. The orderly kept moving, but James's daughter rushed forward from the hallway, her face already transformed by recognition, and she said it loud enough that 3 waiting veterans turned to look, "Your senior Chief Morrison." Her voice cracked on the rank. "Your senior Chief Morrison." The words came again, not a question but an invocation, the way you'd speak the name of someone you'd thought was dead. A nurse at the reception desk looked up. Then another. The waiting room tilted. A veteran nurse who'd served in Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany bent down and picked up Katie's file from where it had slipped from her trembling fingers. No, not trembling, steady as stone, but the file was on the floor and she couldn't move to retrieve it, so the nurse retrieved it and her hands began to shake as she read the words typed there. 2 Bronze Stars. A Navy Cross. 7 combat deployments. The nurse's voice came out fractured, reading each decoration like she was reading from a memorial. Bronze Star for Valor in Combat Operations, Fallujah, 2006. Pause. A breath. The paper rustled. Bronze Star for Leadership Under Fire, Sanjin Valley, 2009. Another pause, longer. Navy Cross for Extraordinary Heroism While Under Enemy Fire, Ramadi. She couldn't finish. Other veterans stood. One by one, they stood. A SEAL team leader who'd been waiting for a prescription refill, silver hair, the kind of face that had weathered 3 decades of operations in places without names, rose from his chair and began speaking with the formality of a military funeral. He named each decoration. He described the operation, how Senior Chief Morrison had held a collapsed building entrance open with her own back for 40 minutes while extracting 12 wounded soldiers from a structure that was folding in on itself, how her spine had absorbed the weight, how her hands had counted every person moving past her, 1, 2, 3, 12, how she'd waited until the last Marine was clear before she moved and the entire structure had collapsed exactly 3.4 seconds after she stepped through. He knew the exact number because he'd been the extraction pilot, because you don't forget the timestamps of the day someone saves your entire unit. He sat back down. The room didn't move. Then an FBI agent stepped forward from the back of the waiting room. She'd been there the whole time, Katie realized, investigating the hospital's billing fraud, and she spoke in the clear, measured voice of someone presenting evidence to a grand jury. Senior Chief Morrison wasn't just a nurse at Oak Creek Memorial. She was an embedded operative. She flagged the procurement irregularities 6 months ago. She documented every transaction. She was the first point of entry for our investigation into Dr. Hargrove's fraud. The agent paused. We have her initial reports in our case file dated March 14th. Everything we've built against him started with her. Dr. Hargrove had been standing in the hallway near the waiting room. Katie didn't know when he'd arrived or why he was at the VA, didn't care, but his face went the color of old bone. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Hospital security was already moving toward him, 2 officers in dark uniforms with the kind of unhurried certainty that meant they'd been called before they arrived, and they took him by the elbows and walked him past the assembled veterans without a single person looking away. His expensive watch caught the light one last time, a $12,000 Rolex that one of those board members had seen him wearing to the country club, and then he was gone and the hallway swallowed the sound of his footsteps. Katie stood without remembering standing. She didn't remember moving, but suddenly her hand was on James's shoulder and he was turning toward her and saying, "Sparrow, I can't see you but I know you're here," and his daughter was weeping and the SEAL team leader was writing something on a piece of paper and handing it to her, coordinates and a date and the words, "The day you saved all of us." The paper felt thin as tissue in her hands. Real. Evidence that it had all been real. Later, hours later, after the VA's administration had taken statements, after the board chair of Oak Creek Memorial had shown up with his own contingent of lawyers and offered her immediate reinstatement, after she'd sat in a hospital administrator's office while they showed her email chains proving Dr. Hargrove had coached the outside HR investigator on what concerns to fabricate, Katie looked at James Keller and at his daughter holding his hand and at the veteran standing in quiet respect. Around her, their shoulders forming a perimeter between her and the rest of the world. The board chair was still talking, his voice sliding past her like water, offering her director of nursing, offering her back pay, offering her an apology printed on hospital letterhead. Katie raised one hand and he stopped speaking. "I need time," she said quietly. "I need to remember who I was before I learned to hide." 6 months passed in montage. Hargrove's plea agreement went through on a Tuesday. Asset seizures followed, the lake house, the Rolex, the investment account seeded with kickback money from 3 different surgical supply vendors. His medical license was revoked by unanimous decision. The outside HR investigator who'd falsified concerns about Katie signed a cooperation agreement in exchange for immunity. The hospital IT specialist, a Marine veteran named Rodriguez who'd noticed Hargrove attempting to delete security footage and financial records at 2 a.m. 3 nights before Katie's termination, produced every frame. Hargrove's face on a monitor, USB drive glowing, deletion confirmations reflected in his glasses. "He didn't know we had redundant backups," Rodriguez said, the satisfaction in his voice like clean water. The fraud unraveled in real time, inflated surgical supply orders dating back 4.7 years, phantom consultations billed to Medicare, kickback arrangements that violated federal health care law. Board members who'd taken Hargrove's campaign donation suddenly found reasons to take early retirement. Then Katie walked into a community college in Savannah on a Thursday afternoon, following a tip that the disgraced doctor was teaching CPR to fulfill the community service component of his plea agreement. She stood in the doorway of a gymnasium-sized room where fluorescent lights buzzed with the sound of insects dying, where Hargrove stood in front of 40 bored students demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy. He wore a polo shirt instead of scrubs now. His expensive watch had been replaced by a Timex that looked like it came from a gas station. His voice, that voice that had once commanded rooms and bent the will of hospital administrators, was reduced to reading from a laminated script. 2.4 inches of compression depth, he droned. 30 compressions, then 2 rescue breaths. 30 compressions, then 2 rescue breaths. The students checked their phones. 3 of them were asleep. He looked up. His eyes found her through the door's window and held for exactly 3 seconds. Katie didn't smile. Didn't gloat. Didn't move. She simply stood there with quiet dignity, her hand resting visibly on the faded unit patch now sewn into her jacket shoulder, the one piece of her old life she'd never been able to throw away, and let him see what he'd tried to destroy. Then she turned and walked back to Oak Creek Memorial where everything had changed and nothing had changed and everything was about to change again. The hospital board had offered her director of nursing. Katie accepted. She implemented fraud detection protocols that became a model for 12 other hospitals in the region. She created a veteran hiring initiative that brought 34 medics and corpsmen into the nursing program. She conducted evening rounds with a composure that made residents straighten their backs and nurses move with intention. James Keller's vision partially returned through surgery Katie helped arrange, a miracle of microsurgery and nerve regeneration, and the simple fact that he had someone with the knowledge and clearance to push the case all the way to Walter Reed. He visited her office weekly now, sitting in the chair across from her desk, and they didn't talk much about Ramadi because the sand was still in their hair and always would be. His daughter brought Katie coffee, and the tattoo on his forearm had been enhanced by a tattoo artist who understood precision, sparrow underneath Morrison in letters that would never fade. In the final moment of the evening shift, Katie conducted rounds on the cardiac unit, checking on a young combat medic struggling with the transition to civilian nursing. His hand shook when he drew blood. His breathing changed during emergencies. The ghosts of decisions made without enough information followed him like shadows. She showed him the faded unit patch on her shoulder, the one that had traveled from Ramadi to Savannah and would travel with her for the rest of her life. "You're not hiding anymore," he said. "Neither are you," Katie replied. She moved through the rest of her rounds like someone moving through water, her shadow passing across each window as she checked monitors and adjusted medications and held the hands of people terrified of dying. The camera of your own memory pulled back and back again, showing her silhouette among the other nurses, indistinguishable until you knew to look, until you understood what quiet heroism looked like when it wore scrubs and moved through the dark with the kind of steady competence that comes from having already survived the worst that the world could offer. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. Did you know that many veterans leave the military and struggle to find purpose? If Katie Morrison's story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, let us know in the comments. What would you have done in her position? Subscribe for more stories of hidden strength and quiet heroism. These are real lives. These are real struggles. And sometimes the most powerful people in a room are the ones nobody's paying attention to.